I have both professional and personal reasons to be excited to be able to introduce Professor Park. In terms of my professional concerns, Professor Park is a renowned scholar of the history of Korea, especially its social history in the early modern and modern periods. He did his undergraduate work at UCLA and then his graduate work at Harvard, earning both a master's and PhD degree there. He has taught as either a full-time or a visiting professor at a number of institutions, including Yale, McGill, the University of California at Irvine, and is presently, as Corey indicated, teaching at the University of Pennsylvania. He's published extensively on the social history of Korea with a lot of interest in the institution of the military, both as a fighting machine, but also how it functions in Korean society. But I was particularly excited when his most recent book came out, modestly titled A Family of No Prominence, but an exploration of changes in the social history of Korea, looking through the lens of his own family background and his own ancestry. The personal reasons why I'm excited is because Gene is my sunbae. When I went to Harvard, he was already there, and he sort of taught me the ropes in many respects in graduate school. And I have fond memories of having discussions about all sorts of things and discovering that he was a treasure trove of knowledge, not only about every single Korean king that ever existed, but also about things like the Byzantine Empire, primates, you name it, he seemed to know everything about it. But one moment I recall when we both, I think we established, we both took the seminar on the Joseon dynasty taught by the late Ed Wagner. And I remember one time after the seminar was over, and we were all gathered around this long seminar table, and he brought and unrolled this scroll of paper on which he had tried to trace back his ancestry as far as he could. And there was branches and lines going everywhere. And this dates us, of course, because this is all in the Stone Age when we actually had to write this stuff down. There was no digital technology. But it really hit home to me that for him, this enterprise of historical inquiry was not some abstract thing, that in part it was an exploration of who he was and where he came from and how he and his family fit into the larger issues of Korean society. And so again, when the book came out, I was delighted. I thought, what better place to have a discussion about these types of issues than here at BYU, where we have people that are interested both in the history and culture and society of Asia, but also interested in the method, the practice of discovering your own ancestry, your own family history. And so without further ado, I'd love to turn the podium over to Professor Park.
Okay, thank you, Professor Larson. Before I begin, I would also like to thank Kennedy Center for hosting me here. Indeed, my pleasure to be here. I thought what might be useful is for me to, the PowerPoint I prepared is a far more dense, it is dense. There's no way I would be able to go through all the slides. So I thought it'd be useful if I could put more emphasis on describing the way Koreans think about ancestry, talk about it today, and why that is the case. So I'll try to keep the historical background or the information to a minimum, and of course I welcome your questions and comments after my presentation. Okay, for anyone who has interacted with or come across Koreans in his or her life, he or she may have noticed that Koreans don't seem to have too many surnames. Most Koreans don't think that way because that's just the way they're used to it. But there are only about a little over 280 surnames that are in use in South Korea. And if I'm not mistaken, the Japanese, for example, is easily a couple of thousand, I think. In fact, in South Korea, it's far easier for somebody to come across somebody with the same surname than with the same given name. Okay? It's different from the U.S. Because certain surnames are so common, historically in Korea, obviously, of course, it makes little sense, or it's not very informative for one to say, I'm a Kim, right? Because 20% of the Koreans are Kims. So that type of information takes on meaning only when a Korean person provides or tells what his or her ancestral seat is, or called something 본관 in Korea. And so when we combine surname and the ancestral seat together, over 4,100 ancestral seat surname combinations are known today in South Korea. And what is remarkable about the way Koreans talk about genealogy today is that for each of such as ancestral seat surname combination, there is elaborate narrative or story that purports to explain who the ancestor is and what the history of that particular descent group, if you will, represented by the surname and ancestral seat is like. And almost without exception, such a narrative, the history is a narrative of royals and aristocrats that descended from a single progenitor who lived centuries, if not even thousands of years ago. If we were to take such contemporary Korean genealogy discourse bounded by these narratives or story at a surface value and take a moment to think about it a bit, then all sorts of contradictions become evident. First of all, this would mean that about 25% of about 80 million Koreans that there are in the world today are descended from just 4 men who lived 1,000 years ago. In other words, a direct patrilineal descent. I mean, that's just not possible biologically. Secondly, on the one hand, so many Koreans seem to be able to tell one something about his or her Gyeongju Kim ancestors of a Shilla kingdom 2,000 years ago, and yet such a person is unlikely to be able to tell you something about his or her great-great-grandparents, what they were doing 100 years ago, what their occupations were, where they were living, where the family graves are. In other words, a memory blackout before the 20th century. Third contradiction is that, and because everybody around me knows that I'm interested in genealogy, a lot of my students and others bring me copies of their family genealogy, and I find that in roughly half the cases, if a Korean family that appears in a contemporary edition of a genealogy, when I consult an older edition about 100 years ago, it's not there. In half the cases. Okay. And lastly, in the last 20 years or so, DNA analysis has enjoyed the breakthroughs in the sense that now, by analyzing a person's Y DNA sequence, it is possible to know when that particular sequence arose because of a certain mutation many, like hundreds of generations ago. But not only that, scientists can also estimate when, roughly how many generations ago, and where that particular mutation had taken place. So as this very simplified map indicates, scientists have a pretty good idea excuse me, as to how different population groups, where they arose and how they migrated. Well, unlike the Jewish people, Jewish males with the traditionally priestly surnames such as Levi, Levine, Cohen, and others, who claim that they're descended from Moses' brother Aaron. And the Y-DNA analysis actually shows that majority of Jewish men with such surnames descend from a single male who lived about 100 generations ago, around the time of Exodus. Okay? In stark contrast, Y-DNA analysis shows that there is no correlation between Y-DNA haplotype or haplogroup and a Korean person's surname or ancestral seed. It's fairly random. Yeah. So So I should stop beating the dead horse. And the argument that I'm here to make today is that the present-day Korean genealogy discourse discussion is bounded by these master narratives, stories that crystallized in the last about 200, 300 years in Korea in the early modern era. Obviously, these stories privilege the elite, that is, kings, queens, royals in general, and aristocrats. And I would like to argue that the overcoming the present Korean genealogy discourse, which certainly privileges the elite, demands asking questions about the agency, human agency in Korean history. And toward the end of my presentation, I'm going to explain a bit more what I mean by this. Okay, this chart, I won't spend too much time on it, shows that the 5 most common surnames out of more than 280 surnames, 5 most common surnames, Kim, Lee, Park, Choi, Jung, account for half of a Korean population. Okay. And the most common ancestral seat surname combinations such as Kim, Miryang Park, Jeonju Lee, Gyeongju Kim, and others account for about 30% of the population. Okay. Making sense of the current, the way modern-day Koreans talk about their genealogy requires some background information on Korean history. In the early modern, in medieval Korea, when a kingdom called the Shilla, which used to at one point control the central and southern Korea, fell apart in the 9th century, local strongmen arose in different parts of Korea. And when the new Goryeo dynasty brought southern 2/3 of the Korean peninsula under its control, for some time, the local control was left in the hands of such local strongmen families. And over a period of time, such local strongmen were gradually transformed into hereditary local functionaries, officers who performed the administrative duties for the central government on a daily basis. And such positions were passed down from one generation to another. And among such local functionaries, some by passing the government service examination and others through various other institutionalized venues, they became central officials. And in Korea, from this point on, becoming a central official meant one became an aristocrat. In other words, being a central official increasingly became synonymous with being an aristocrat in medieval and early modern Korea. And eventually, most certainly by the 14th, 15th century, the term yangban, which literally means two lines or two branches of central officials, namely civil and the military officials, became synonymous with the aristocracy, in the sense that by the Joseon period, yangban, or aristocratic status, was something that one had to be born with. It was not something that one could achieve through talent or merit or by passing the government service examination. It became a scriptive status category. And while all these developments were taking place, elite Koreans became more aware of, and they began emphasizing their ancestry, descent, as recognized through the patrilineal connection, that is from male of one generation to the next. By the early modern period in Korea, the status hierarchy came to comprise 4 tiers or the categories. All the way at the top were the aristocrats, the yangban, who, as is true in the most early modern societies with a hereditary aristocracy, they did not make up more than, say, 5% of the population, probably more like 2-3%. I mean, one just cannot have a society where everybody's an aristocrat, right? these aristocrats were not only aristocrats at the beginning of the dynasty, but in order for their descendants to maintain that status, they have to be able to show, increasingly through documentation such as genealogies, that in the intervening generations, there was no illegitimacy or illegitimate son. Just below the aristocracy was a status category called a 중인, which literally means a middle people. The narrow definition middle people, or 중인, included central government employee, capital resident, technical specialists such as physicians, interpreters, astronomers or astrologers, depending on how you want to look at pre-modern science, the accountants, painters, musicians. In other words, people who had a certain expertise that were valued by the state, and these individuals are employed by the state. So this is a narrow definition, 중인. The broad definition, middle people, 중인, includes all of the above, plus capital functionaries, local functionaries, as well as the illegitimate children of 양반 and northern local elites, northern part of Korea. Middle people too was a relatively small in population, perhaps no more than 5, at max 10% of the population, which meant that the majority of the population were commoners, the vast majority of whom were farmers, the commoner peasants. Early modern Korea stands out from the rest of East Asia in that until 1894, Korea maintained a relatively large, unfree population of chattel slaves, those who could be bought and sold. And the term that was used to label the slaves in early modern period was lowborn, or chunmin in Korean. So from this point on, then, I would like to survey how the Koreans descended, Koreans, depending on their ancestors' status category, have dealt with the genealogy and ancestry consciousness differently in the last 2 centuries. And of course, most Koreans are not descendants of aristocrats, but what happened in the last 100 to 150 years is that those Koreans, the vast majority of Koreans have lost memory of their actual history, in the sense where now any outside observer who might ask a Korean person about ancestry would be left with the impression that every Korean is now of aristocratic descent. So let me begin with the aristocracy. In the early modern era, the kind of master narratives, stories that purport to explain a particular surname, ancestral seed combinations, the history crystallized. They became set in stone, and through inventing tradition. In the 17th and 18th century, all families devise such stories to the extent where now today in Korea, anybody who is interested in tracing his or her ancestry has to deal with such master narratives. But at the same time, it's next to impossible to look beyond master narratives. In other words, in Korea today, there's a little sense of doing the kind of genealogical research that you and I would expect in the United States by looking at census documents and other types of documentation that have been passed down through generations or have been maintained by the government. These master narratives genealogically connect all descent lines of a same surname and the ancestral seed to a single common ancestor. And this was the pattern that became universal by the 19th century, whereas genealogies published in the 17th century actually frankly admit that we do not know how these different lines of a same surname or ancestral seed are related or connected at all. So all these changes took place only in the last 200 years or so. In the modern era, since the late 19th century, descendants of aristocrats have generally continued to participate in the culture of compiling or updating genealogy as an objective record of a family history. The impression I have talking to Koreans of aristocratic descent is that it's just part of their history, and it's not something you like or dislike about it, and you just these are traditions. Genealogy compilation continues to this day among the Koreans of aristocratic descent. It's also interesting that those Koreans who are of true aristocratic descent, many families have been setting trend by departing from traditional practices. So, for example, traditionally, early modern Korean genealogy records all legitimate children of a male first, but boys first, followed by girls. And then such children are followed by, the listing is followed by all the children mothered by concubines, but commoner concubines first. So boys first, girls first, okay? And then they're followed by the illegitimate children mothered by slave concubines. So in other words, it's not by strict birth order, but more recently, Korean families of true aristocratic descent have departed from that tradition by listing children strictly by birth order in the way I guess you and I would think about, would record children. Unlike traditional genealogies that do not even bother to record given names of daughters, many modern genealogies do. In other words, treating the daughters, women, with a greater respect and humanity. And many contemporary Korean genealogies of aristocratic families even they indicate accomplishments of our daughters, their bachelor's degrees or any advanced degrees that she may hold. And again, these are new patterns. Finally, I should mention that Korean families of aristocratic descent show greater flexibility vis-a-vis male generational characters. What I mean by generational character is that among many Koreans and Chinese today, male often has a two-syllable given name, and one of the two syllables is a character or ideograph that he shares with not just with his brothers but cousins, first cousin, second cousin, third cousin. It could be such character could be shared by even very distant cousin. It indicates the proper genealogical generational sequence in the genealogy, but many aristocratic families don't use these patterns anymore today. The reason why I'm showing these two maps is that in the early modern era, okay, as of 1402, this was the Korean people's sense of understanding of the world. There's Korean Peninsula, which is not that much smaller than the Chinese Empire, and beyond China, you could see that they had the foggiest notion about what the world was like geography-wise. And then those lowly Japanese inhabit these small, tiny islands to the south of Korea. But their knowledge of the world improved tremendously by the 18th century. It looks a lot more like our map, right? Except that they thought that the further south you go, it gets warmer and warmer. And so the Antarctica is basically a place that is just blazing hot. So in that sense, we're looking at some sort of a remarkable progress in knowledge. But as far as the genealogy is concerned, arguably, they went backward in time. What happened is that, here, we see a historical record, official history, that actually records this particular surname, Kong, as a native or indigenous surname of this particular county in Korea called Changwon. Okay? This Kong, by the way, is the same character as the one that's used by the family of Confucius and their descendants. Okay? So in 1454, official Korean source understood Kong as at least a Kong in Korea as a native Korean name, but the same type of a document from 1794 records that when the king was told that two Kong surnamed men passed the recent government service examination, he was overjoyed, declaring that descendants of Confucius have come to our country and that this is a special occasion to celebrate. So you could see here then an example of a tradition being invented over a period of perhaps about 2-3 centuries. And today, of course, if I were to suggest otherwise to Koreans with a surname Kong, they might protest or they might be unhappy about the certain claims that I'm making here. Now, moving down the social pyramid, I turn to the Jungin, the middle people. In the early modern era, when the Jungin, just like the aristocracy, maintained their own genealogical records, they were generally frank about admitting that their ancestry could not be traced beyond the early modern era. They honestly admitted that. And this is a good point for me to point out that this is also true for other Eurasian societies at the middle social tier. So for example, Western Europe. Of course, somebody like Queen Elizabeth or anybody who was an aristocrat or a royal as of 1900, let's say, a person could easily trace his or her direct ancestry back to the Middle Ages. Okay? But as of 1900, somebody who was a professional member of the bourgeois middle class, say a music composer, they generally in Europe, they could not trace their genealogy beyond the early modern era. And that this pattern also applies to Korea as well. So the middle people were frank at admitting that. But once we get into the modern era, we find the Jungin families, many of them inventing tradition. They're connecting their families or family descent lines to aristocratic descent lines. But that was not the only response, because the Jungin category is interesting in that we see three very distinct patterns of behavior. So one is inventing tradition. While actually the most common response when Korea as a traditional social hierarchy disintegrated was to reject this whole culture, traditional culture of a genealogy compilation. In other words, not even bothering with it anymore. What happened was that many Jungin, as they welcomed Western institutions and ideas, including Christianity and learning English, sending their children to modern schools, and also even educating their daughters, they rejected traditional customs as something feudal, something backward. So here, okay, to go from one generation to another, you have to go from one line to the next line. Okay, on your left, you see a family genealogy where a person who was born in the 1820s has a son who was a recorded son who was born in the 1887, and the coverage continues to the present era with the children who were born in the 1960s and 70s, whereas their very distant cousins or relatives who were of a Jungin social status in the early modern era, the coverage stops in the mid or the late 19th century. In other words, here we see that the birth year is recorded, but the no death year, meaning that after the 19th century, they stopped participating in genealogy compilation. I find this pattern very common among the descendants of Jungin in Korea today. This is an example. Here we see records that gives us a better sense of what inventing tradition was like. Here, a page from an 1873 Miryang Park family genealogy. Here's a man indicated inside the circle named Ju. He had three sons, Eungyung, Hyungyung, and Wongyung. But the edition that was published a bit later in 1920. So we see the same man, Ju, and under him, we see sons Eungyung, Hyungyung, Wongyung, and the extra, the fourth son out of nowhere, Tokwa. Actually, this is my family. So this was just commonly done in the modern era. A son out of nowhere, or claims that we were left out centuries ago, and please include us. And in most cases, the families were not too particular or picky about including these newcomers. And if anyone's interested, I could explain more during the question and discussion section. This is a newspaper editorial from 1928 criticizing how so many Koreans in colonial Korea under the Japanese rule are obsessed with the genealogy. In fact, the genealogy was the most common type of a licensed publication in colonial Korea. This editorial is rhetorically asking, what meaning does it have for Koreans to talk about their Yangban ancestors and royals and whatnot when Koreans don't even have their own country anymore? So, and that this type of a sentiment was quite commonly expressed among urban intellectuals, clearly reflecting the kind of attitude of a Jungin who decided not to participate in the genealogy compilation anymore. Now we turn to the commoners and the lowborn, who account for the majority, vast majority of Koreans today. In the early modern era, most of them resorted to inventing tradition by increasingly adopting surnames and the ancestral seat, thus adopting the appearance of being an aristocrat. They also latched their descent lines onto pre-existing ones, as I explained a moment ago. Not only that, such families rather strictly adhere to recording male members with generational characters while not even bothering to record daughters before the modern era. So you might think, why are they behaving in such a conservative way, or the manners that are even more conservative than the descendants of the real Yangban, right? And the concept that a famous sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, used was the hysteresis effect. That is, when social newcomers have the luxury to imitate or adopt the customs or the behaviors of the elite or the aristocracy, they often end up adopting behaviors of the norms that have already gone out of fashion among aristocrats. It's a hysteresis effect. So to offer my final thoughts, what we're seeing here through these three types of behavior: inventing tradition, number one; number two, rejecting hegemonic discourse, or that is rejecting the custom or the practice that subjugates certain types of people, denigrates certain status categories; and thirdly, recording family history as is, treating genealogy as an objective family history record. These three behaviors suggest distinct phases of liberation, I argue, from the hegemonic discourse. What I mean by hegemonic discourse is certain customs or behaviors or the norms that privilege the elite, in this case, the aristocracy. And the first phase of liberation is the social recognition of ancestors' achievements regardless of status. What I mean by this is that in many, if not most, pre-modern societies, to be honored and celebrated and recognized, one had to be an aristocrat or had to be of elite status. But as we get into the modern era, a society begins to value or appreciate a person for his or her talent or merit or accomplishments, regardless of his or her status. So that's the first phase. And the second phase comes when the descendants of such non-elite individuals with accomplishments start expressing their pride, and in other words, that they're not by doing so, they're not afraid to admit that they are descended from non-elites. That's the second phase. And the third phase comes when more and more people begin to rethink genealogy as an objective record of family history rather than a record that is meant to show off one's aristocratic descent. And finally, the last phase features narrating family history regardless of ancestors' achievements. And in the fields of European history and Japanese history, many scholars, historians have written works that present longue durée, multi-generational narrative history of even a peasant family, a merchant family spanning centuries. For Korea, we don't see that, and we just don't. And my book that Professor Larson mentioned the book that came out in March was my attempt to defy that norm. Not because my family is interesting or my ancestors did anything terribly impressive, but I thought the process of discovering my roots, even though they're not Yangban or the aristocracy, and how they weathered Korea's turbulent transition to modernity are interesting. They could share, they allow us a certain insights on the change that the Korean society underwent in the last 200-300 years. For the most part, these 4 phases that I just outlined, I would say the 3rd and the 4th still do not apply, are not applicable to Korea. In fact, they're more like wishful thinkings on my part, because so even the social historians, professional historians who work on Korea, their subject personalities or the subject matter still overwhelmingly favor those of an elite social status. In other words, one could just, it's very difficult to find a book or article in the Korean history field that looks at the long-term, longue durée history of a non-aristocratic family. So in the end then, I would like to suggest that there are at least a couple of implications of rethinking modern Korean genealogy discourse. One is that okay, at least in history as a field, decades ago, historians, professional historians, began emphasizing reconstructing the lives, better understanding of ordinary people. In other words, it is no longer fashionable for professional historians to say that the great men make history. I mean, when I was a kid in the 70s, sure, I used to come across such claims everywhere. But no, it's just not fashionable anymore. At least a mainstream historian is supposed to look at or try to uncover, better understand what the ordinary people live their lives to make sense of a larger history. So the term minjung is a Korean word that some professional Korea historians and intellectuals in the 70s came up with to refer to the ordinary people who of course are poorly documented, right? That's true in any society. And the important main mission of a historian is to better understand the lives of the ordinary people, the minjung in Korean. A second implication that I'd like to suggest is that finding that the kind of a genealogical research, as I try to outline through this presentation, helps us better understand Korea as a place in the larger Eurasian history. As I mentioned earlier, how far we can trace an aristocratic family's genealogy, which is sometime in the Middle Ages, and how far we can trace a Jungin family's genealogy, or the middle class family's genealogy, which is typically the beginning of the early modern era. And for most commoners or ordinary people, probably the modern era, right? You cannot go back beyond that. These patterns apply more or less uniformly throughout Eurasia. In fact, among professional genealogists, one of the ongoing challenges is to identify or find a living human being whose reliable genealogy could be traced back to the antiquity, like say classical Rome, Greece, or the Achaemenid Persia or whatnot. Because even with somebody like Queen Elizabeth, we cannot trace her genealogy back beyond the Middle Ages. There seems to be some barrier between the Middle Ages and the antiquity. And by better understanding or studying Korean genealogies within this context, I think Korean history can make certain contributions to periodizing Eurasian history. Thank you.
If you'd like to ask a question, we'd please ask you just to come up to the microphone. Tell us your name and what you're studying, and you'll be the first question.
Sorry, what was the first question? Hi, I'm Ruby Higgins. I'm studying Korean. I'm a Korean studies major. And I actually did a paper last semester on Korean Chokbo, and I was wondering how you thought that the dynamic of the family and like the social dynamic of the family in modern Korea has changed as genealogy has changed. Like now you say that women are being added into the genealogical record. How does that like imply like the social class now? Like, does that make sense? Does that? I'm really excited about this question because that's what my paper was on.
Okay.
Yeah, like because back a long time ago, women were part of their husband's family. So now are they seen as both part of their husband's family and their biological family? Yes.
Sure. Yeah, the kind of changes that I mentioned, right? The recording children by birth order, recording accomplishments of the daughters, and recording their given name. These are clearly reflections of how the Korean society has changed, right? But what I find interesting is that such departures from the old genealogy practices, these initiatives are taken by the descendants of real Yangban, perhaps the people who have no insecurity about who their ancestors were, but at the same time they're willing to be the leaders. Whereas, although it's hard for me to quantify, the newcomer families, that is the families who have come to claim Yangman status in the last 100 or 150 years, they tend to be conservative about these practices, adhering to the old norms.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, so happy to have you here. I'm Eric Heyer. I'm the coordinator for Asian Studies, but I teach contemporary Chinese politics, so I'll probably reveal some of my ignorance about Korean history and Chinese history. I'm just intrigued about the emergence of what you refer to as an aristocracy in Korea with Yangban and things like that. Because my sense is in China, it may be wrong, but that given the and Korea's adherence to Confucian culture, given the Confucian examination system, it seemed to be open avenues for even common people that had the means to rise up through and to retain high levels of government service because of the civil service examinations. So how did the Confucian examinations, which would tend to open up high-level government appointments to common people, how did that relate to the emergence of an aristocracy in Korea?
Yes. Both China and traditional China and Korea maintained the different types of examinations. Some examinations were prestigious than others, and the most prestigious examinations, the passers of those most prestigious examinations were far more likely to obtain meaningful positions in the government. So in Korea, in Joseon, Korea, examination, even the most prestigious examination, that is a civil examination, was administered in a way that, for the most part, it was monopolized by a small percentage of the population, even the smallest percentage of the literate population. Okay, even among within the aristocracy, those who lived in Seoul, the capital, dominated the examination system. But at the same time, in the last 100 or 150 years or so of the Joseon dynasty, there are some new families that are producing examination passers for the first time. And what this seems to indicate is that certain families, especially in northern Korea, certain commercialized regions, these families were investing their new wealth in educating their children, some of whom went on to pass these examinations. So that in itself is a change or accomplishment. But the problem is, such newcomers who passed the examination, they were kept out of the meaningful positions in the government. In other words, passing the examination alone was not enough. I should also add by mentioning that the most prestigious examination, the civil examination, Munkwa in Korean, which civil officials had to pass, produced more than 14,600 passers throughout the Joseon period, which lasted 500 years. Joseon Korea's population as of 1910 I don't know, very roughly between 15 and 20 million, let's say. So that's a very small percentage of the population, right? Entire Joseon period, 14,000. Military exam, which was far more inclusive, recruit a far larger number of candidates, about 150,000 people passed that exam, people from very diverse social backgrounds. So the state then, the Joseon Korean state, maintained different types of examination systems to provide the wider segment of the population some sense that that they were part of the system. There were opportunities available for them, but obviously, clearly there were glass ceilings, or real ceilings, I should say. Yeah.
My name's Jennifer Hansen. I'm not affiliated with the university, but I was wondering, with so many identical names, is it possible to actually trace your own ancestry? And if so, how far back can you go? And how do you distinguish between who is your ancestor and who is someone else of the same name?
Yeah. In South Korea, every adult not only knows his or her surname, of course, but also the ancestral seat. And he or she, and there's government document that shows it, records it. Whereas in North Korea, evidently this knowledge is lost. It's been reported that the younger defectors, they don't know their ancestral seat. They only know their names, given name and surname. Okay? I suppose in North Korea, which the communist system, there was no incentive or reason for people to maintain such identities or baggages from the feudal era. At any rate, so based on one's surname Kim, let's say, and the ancestral seat Kimhae, which is the most common ancestral seat among Kim surname Koreans, one can then look up, consult reference books, encyclopedias, go online to find all these stories about different branches, famous individuals who are Kimhae Kim. But the problem is, of course, before the early modern era, only a small percentage of Koreans had surnames and the ancestral seat to begin with. In other words, the rest of the population had adopted these identities in the last 200-300 years. So where does one go from there? And this was definitely my challenge when I was a child. Then you have to consult household registration documents, the military registers, the land register, as well as the official history, historical accounts, although kind of people who are recorded in these historical accounts tend to be aristocrats, right? So that's what one needs to do, but they're all in classical Chinese, language which vast majority of Koreans can no longer read. It's a very difficult language for people to learn. So I easily admit that had I not become a professional historian, I would have never found my ancestry, at least not through my father's side, because they were not of a Yangban descent.
Please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.